I've now started the recording, so anything we do will be recorded, and I'm going to share my screen. So I'm sharing my screen. Okay. So what you see in front of you is zyBooks. zyBooks is the main learning tool that we use in IT140. If you've taken this class previous to last term, you will have used something called Codio. We no longer use Codio, we only use zyBooks now. So, and by the way, you can ignore this section on the right, that's for instructors. The other thing I'm going to do, let me bring that up, is I'm going to bring up PyCharm. PyCharm is a Python IDE, which means Integrated Development Environment, and it's something that you will be using when you're doing your projects. I like to start using PyCharm right off the bat. I don't wait until week 2 or week 3 to demonstrate what's going on to students. I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to say it's just a Python project, pure Python, and I'm just going to call it Module 1. Okay. So I've opened PyCharm. What is wrong? Okay. I just upgraded my Mac, so this is probably happening because I haven't updated my PyCharm. But for what we need tonight, this will be fine. So I'm going to introduce PyCharm while we're going through some other things, partly because the zyBooks that I have is a little different from the zyBooks that you have. The zyBooks that I have is for all the instructors. So there's not an individual zyBooks for each instructor. We all share the same zyBook instance. So that means I'm really not going to code in zyBooks. Any coding I do will always be in PyCharm. So anybody have any questions about the basic structure of what's going to happen tonight? Okay. So for Module 1, we are going to start with Introduction to Programming, Variables, and Expressions. Now, basically, all that we're talking about at this point is just how do you get started? What do you do? Don't worry about my instructor's note. What are happening in the computers? Well, what's happening in a computer is input, process, and output. And actually, I'm going to bring up, ignore some of that stuff, SNHU, week 1, that's the one I want, yes. I am going to bring up what is a variable. And on my YouTube channel, I actually have a video about what variables are. But before, let's see, sorry. So this is, ignore that. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about with variables. The first thing they talk about is, could I have everybody mute, please? Thank you. So, go back to that. No, not everybody's muted. And I have a question. If I'm in IT200, is this call applicable? This call, Debbie, is for IT140. I don't know what the requirements are for IT200. If you are learning to program in Python, this might be helpful, but we are specifically following the requirements for IT140. No problem. So let's go back to zyBooks. So what are we talking about when we talk about computer programming? We're talking about input, output, and process. And really let me go back to my little graphic here. Okay. Your link was on CS210. I don't know why my link was on CS210, Catherine. When I sent this announcement out, it was sent as IT140. It was sent supposedly to just the IT140 teachers. If I didn't get that right, I apologize, but this class follows IT140. So I apologize if your instructor took my announcement and posted it on their site for CS200. Yes, this follows IT140, not IT200. I apologize if there was any confusion with what your professor did. And could somebody please mute their phones? I'm going to just mute that. See if that was it. Okay. Okay. No apologies. No, nothing to apologize for. Somebody still has it. Okay. So yeah, somebody still, I'm going to go through, give me just a second. I'm going to go through and mute everyone. Who's not muted? That's not muted. Okay, that's not muted. Okay, let me go up and see who else isn't muted. Okay. I'm not muted. I think everybody else is muted. Oops, nope, one more isn't muted. Okay, and that just means there's no feedback on the recording. So let's go back and talk about the basics of computer programming. The basics of computer programming are input, process, and output. That's it, 3 things. Input is something, some instruction, usually some data that is being used. It's going to be taken externally and put into your Python script. Your Python script is then going to do something with that data, and then it's going to provide some result, which we call output. And that's basically it. It's 3 things: input, process, and output. And if you always remember that sequence, it will start you off easier. Now, the input can be a lot of different things. The calculations can be a lot of different things, or the process can be a lot of different things. And the output can be a lot of different things. And so what we have is a way of making things extremely variable and figuring out how to do lots of things. This same model works if you're doing detailed mathematical science calculations or if you're taking user input for a computer game. It is always input, process, and output. And by the way, if you have any questions, let me know. I will check zyBooks chat and try and answer them. Well, I'm glad that you liked the videos when you took the class, Peter. Okay, so that's the basic way we're going to do things. So now how do we actually do it? Well, the first thing we have to talk about is something called a variable. Okay, a variable is a way to store that input. And it's a way to store intermediate things in the process as well. And a variable is just a bucket. So I like to use this graphic. This is what a variable is. You can think of a variable as a bucket. It has a scope, which we won't get into for a little bit. I don't know why those things keep coming up. It has a name, which we're going to start off with right now. and it contains a value. So you can think about it as if you have a bucket and you write a name on the bucket. Let's just call it Lisa's bucket. And then I put something in the bucket. Let's say I put sand in the bucket. So the value of my bucket is the amount of sand I have in it. Or let's say I call it bank account and I put all my change into my bank account bucket. And so the value in my bucket, in my bank account bucket, is the sum of all that change. Now the change could be I may only have a single quarter in there, or I may have $10 worth of quarters, nickels, dimes, and pennies in there. The bank account bucket is always the same. What's in the bucket can change. So that's when we're talking about variables. That's what we're talking about. We are talking about a place to store something. You can have a place to store sand. You can have a place to store money. You can have a place to store baseball cards. But that's all a variable is. So when you're thinking about it from a conceptual standpoint, a variable is a bucket. You've written a name on the bucket, and you're going to put something into the bucket. And so please think about that when we're talking about variables. For me, personally, it's always better to have a visual. Now, not everybody works like that, and if you don't need these visuals, don't worry about it. But the visuals are here in case you do, in case you learn like I do. So we're not going to go through scope right now, but we are going to go back to zyBooks. And they talk a little bit about a computer program. And their example here is you're getting input, and then you're doing something with the input, and then you're outputting something. And so that's input, process, output. Somebody inputs the number 2, and it gets assigned to X. So X is the name of a variable. There are some rules to the name of a variable that we'll talk about in a minute. But how do I know when I'm looking at this that X is a variable? Well, there's something very telling here. I have a string that is not quoted that is on the left-hand side of a single equal sign. So let me make this a little bigger. Is it going to let me make this bigger? Okay. So what I have here is I have the character X. There's no quotes around it because quotes mean something different. It's just the character X. I have to the right of that, I have a single equal sign. And I say single equal sign specifically because there's a difference if you have 2 equals. But right now we're just going to worry about the single equal. And then after that I have something. Now this is pseudocode, this isn't actually Python. So I wanted to let you know that because you won't ever have get next input on the right hand side in a Python code because it won't work. So I'm not going to go through those. So this is just your first programming activity. By the way, just to let you know, all of the activities, all the participation activities in zyBooks are run them as many times as you want until you get them right. So you can go through these activities and check them until you're right. You can go through this participation activity and do it again and again until it's right. So don't give up points. If you have the time, continue to go through your participation activities to get the highest amount of points for those participation activities. Because all the points in the end add up. So here they're talking about computational thinking, and this again is a conceptual thing. And basically what it's talking about is it's talking about how to solve a problem and create what they call an algorithm. Well, an algorithm is just a series of instructions to a computer in a way the computer that can understand, that communicates what you want to do to a computer or what you want the computer to do. And now algorithms are great because they tell the computer exactly what you want to do. And algorithms are frustrating because it will tell the computer to do exactly what you told it to do. Now, I made those sentences a little different because what you intend to do in that algorithm isn't always what it does. And the difference is called the bugs. And there are bugs in code. People write code. There are always bugs. But that's all an algorithm is. When they start talking about computational thinking and algorithms, you're learning in this class how to talk to a computer and get that computer to do what you want. The tool that we use is Python, and you are going, unless you've had programming classes before, you are going to learn a different way of thinking because computers don't talk in a language that's complex. We talk in very simplistic languages. So we, as the smarter human beings, have to sit down and learn how to talk to a computer. And that's what a language is. And then you have to learn how to think to talk to the computer. Now, Python is a tool, it's a language. But the thinking part you can take to just about any language. Once you understand how to break down a problem and build it back up again into these algorithms, you can take that ability anywhere with any language. Learn the syntax, learn some of the ins and outs of the language. So, programming using Python. That's enough of me talking about the conceptual stuff. So, Python, they talk here about the Python interpreter. And we will only use Python in its interpreted form. However, please remember that Python can also be compiled. And compiling just means that you're putting it closer to the operating system. In its interpreted mode, Python isn't very close. Python has to go through and change every line of code into something that the underlying operating system can understand. And so it's in its interpreted mode. You can compile it and use it in its compiled form, and that's faster. But there's no harm in using it as an interpreter. So let's see. Executing a program, you can go through that. Basic input and output. So you bring in information, that's the user input, and then you output information, that's the final result. And there are specific ways to do that. And the way we're going to start doing that, and they start talking about output first. And output is just a print statement. Now, this, let me show you. This is a statement in Python. So if I bring up my PyCharm and I start a new file, a new Python file, and by the way, you can get the Python Professional Edition for nothing, for free, because you're an SNHU student. So you can download the Community Edition, or you can go under their educational website and request a free professional, and it's just got some nice features. So I just wanted to let you know that. So I'm just going to call this input output. So I have a file now called input-output.py. And what I'm going to do, I apologize, I will fix for next time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say sample output. And, sorry, it's not happy. I will have to upgrade this before it go away. Okay. Yeah, it's not going to let me do that. Nope. Okay, I'm going to update this. Okay. Update and restart. And see if this fixes the issue. So while I'm doing that, let's go back to inputting. So this is a statement. When I talk about a statement, I'm talking about a single line of Python code. And in this case, we have a print, what I call a print statement. Why do I call it a print statement? Because it uses the print function. Print is a function in Python that we get just for using Python. Print will output your, it will output strings to the console. And what do I mean by the console? Well, all of us here are used to graphical user interfaces. And that's great. But before there were graphical interfaces, there was just text to the screen. And that's what I mean by outputting a string to the console. What you're going to see when Python runs is you're going to see hello there as a string, just like this, but without the quotes, on Python. Let's see if PyCharm is up and running. It says it is. Will it let me configure the interpreter? Nope. I am so sorry that I updated to the latest version of Mac OS. So let me do this and see if I can get a terminal. Utilities. So I'm really going to do this old school right now until I get this fixed. Okay. 2716. That's good enough for now. And I want to make this bigger. View bigger. Okay. Okay. So hopefully this will be big enough for everyone to see. So if I do Python, I get, and I'm just describing this to you for a minute, and then next time I'll have PyCharm working. Basically, I'm inside the interpreter now, and Python is waiting for me to do something. So I'm going to, first of all, use a print statement, and I'm going to say, hello there. And that's what I get to the screen. This is what I mean by it's printing something to the console. I have told Python I want to put something out to the console, and I've told it what I want to put out to the console. Now you'll notice it's in quotes. That's very important. If I did print hello there, let's just make it identical. I get an error. I get an error that doesn't make a lot of sense to most people, but I get an error. And it says standard in line 1. Print hello there. Syntax error, invalid syntax. That's because I don't have quotes. If I add quotes, whether they be single or double quotes, I get hello there. Also, and that's because we are going to go through this in a minute, if I have like open with a single quote and close with a double quote, I get this errored EOL while scanning literal string. That's because your quotes have to match. If you start with a single quote, you have to end with a single quote. If you start with a double quote, you have to end with a double quote. And when I change that double quote to a single quote, I'm good. So now let's go back to zyBooks, and we'll keep on going. So we have our first challenge activity, which talks about outputting simple text. And it says, write the simple statement that prints the following. So I'm going to go do that, and it's just going to look like, let's go to the terminal, 3, 2, 1, go. I'm just going to copy that because that makes my life easier. So, whoops, wrong terminal. I'm going to print that. Oops. And I get 3, 2, 1, go. And that's all I have to do for that first challenge is print that out. So now I'm not going to go through each challenge like that, but when they say write the simplest statement that prints the formatting, there are 2 cues here of what you need to do. You need to write something out to the console. And it's telling you also that it prints the following. If it says it prints the following, you're going to use a print statement. So let's see. We will go to a little bit harder one later on. So this is all just about print statements. Now we're talking about something like outputting multiple items with one statement. So okay. So let's go outputting a variable's value. Let me go back to this one. What they're talking about is we have a variable wage and it's equal to 20. And we want to print the value of wage. Now there's a couple of different ways to do this. First of all, let's make wage equal 20. So what am I doing here? I'm setting the variable named wage. So this is my bucket. I've taken a Sharpie on it, and I wrote wage. And then I'm going to set the value in wage to the number 2. 2 is an integer. Talk a little bit more about types in a moment. So that's great. So what can I do with wage right now based on what I know? Well, the only thing I can do with wage is I can print it. Now you'll notice I did not put quotes around wage. That is because I want to use wage as a variable. And if I reference wage, that tells Python to pull that value out. So I'm pulling it out of the bucket and I'm printing it to the console. That's why I did not put quotes around wage. Instead, I just use wage as a variable. So there's a difference when something has quotes around it and doesn't. And I'll show you an example. If I print wage with quotes, it's going to give me back wage because those quotes say this is a string. And the wage in quotes is not the same as the wage without quotes. The wage without quotes has a value of 2. The wage with quotes is a string, and it's just like you wrote wage on a piece of paper. So let's go back to zyBooks. So now, how do I print out wage with something else? How do I make wage understandable? Because when it puts out 2, it makes no sense. So what am I going to do? Well, I am going to use a special syntax. The syntax is I'm going to print the word wage, and then I've got a comma here, and I'm going to use the value of wage. And that's the way you read this. When you see wage like this, you are accessing the value contained in the wage variable. So let's go do that. And I'm going to print wage. I'm going to put a space there, wage, and I get wage 2. Now the other thing I can do here is I can use a plus sign, and we'll, stir an int, my bad. And the error that I just got is because the value of wage is 2, which is an integer, and you can't add a string and an integer. You can add a string and a string, though. So this function, what we're about to get to, says change what's coming out. So wage will come out when I access it as the integer 2. But just this once, make it a string, and that allows me to add those two together. Now we're also going to see another way to do this in a minute, but this is one way. And I think it is more, I think it is clearer when people start. So, let's see. These are new line characters. They're escape characters, and there's a whole section on escape characters. I don't think there are any challenges with escape characters in them. Let's see. That's a challenge activity. Basic input. This is something you need to understand because inputting is something you are going to do for the remainder of this class. Every piece of input that comes externally from the program will come using an input statement. So let's see, what do they talk about? Where do they, okay, so there's something called an input function. This is the input function. So if I say input something, Python's just going to sit here. And it's going to sit here until I input something. Let me say I'm going to input 4. And then it will output 4. And it output 4 just because we're in the interpreter. But this is very important because this takes in user input. It will take in user input specifically and importantly when you're doing your projects. Okay? So a user is going to have to input whether they're going to move north, south, east, or west. The only way you can get that piece of information is to understand how this input statement works. So input is a function. And let me go back and do this because I didn't do it with print. Input is the name of a function. All functions in Python have an open parenthesis immediately after the name of the function and a closing parenthesis immediately after the last parameter. For what we are doing this week, you only have to worry about strings or strings and variables. That's all you have to worry about. So the input function takes in a string and does something with it. Well, what does it do? In this case, it prints it out to the screen, and then it says, okay, I'm just going to wait for somebody to do something. And then I put in the number 4, and it spits back the number 4 to me. So that's what this line is. So input is a function. It always starts with an opening parenthesis and a closing parenthesis, and there may be something in between that parenthesis. And for input, it is always a string. And a string is just anything in quotes. So that's input. And so this is type conversion. Okay. There are, let's go back to here. There are 4 types in Python. There is an integer, a float, a string, and a Boolean. Those are the 4 types. The only types we care about for this week are integer, float, and string. Well, first of all, why do I care? I care about types because types say how much information, how much space a piece of information takes up in a program. And right now when we're writing programs for this class, we're probably never going to take up too much space for our computer. But it's always important to understand that, especially if you want to go on and program in Python, because there are two resources on a computer. There's space and speed. Space is how much everything's taken up, and a running program takes up space. And the space is the size of the program plus the data. And speed is how fast does it run. Now, speed goes to the efficiency of your algorithm. Space goes to the amount of data that you're using. So it's just an aside, but I think it's an important aside. So what is an integer? An integer is just that. It's a number, a whole number, so there's no decimal points. A float is a number as well, but the float has a decimal point. So a float is 1.2 and an integer is 1. A string is pretty much anything in quotes. If you put it in quotes, it becomes a string. So those are the three types, and we can convert from one type to another. We can take a string and make it an integer, as long as it's a valid integer inside the quotes. We can make a float and make it a string. These are done using functions. So the functions that you have are int, stir, and I think float, but I don't think we actually need that one. So let me do this. So I'm going to say print int to stir. So as I said earlier, wage is an integer. We know wage is an integer because when I look at the value to the right of the single equal sign, it's a whole number. It doesn't have a decimal point. It does not have quotes around it, so it's a whole number. So I know that if I'm going to use it in a print statement, I have to do something. Because before, when I tried and I didn't do something, I got this weird error. So I have to convert it. I have to make it into a string for just this once. Whoops, for just this once. And I do that using a function. The name of the function is called stir. It always opens with a left-hand parenthesis. It closes with a right-hand parenthesis. And in this case, I'm adding the variable wage. I could have just put an integer in there. It would have been the same. Let me double check the question. Would print into stir, stir wage accomplish the same thing? I think so. Let me check. I'm a little old-fashioned in some of my syntax. Let's put a comma here and answer the question. No, it does not accomplish the same thing. So what happened here is it turned this into a collection because I have two things. I have an int to stir string and a 2 that is now a string. But I want them to print out, whoops, my bad. Whoops, I can't do that. I'm not in PyCharm. But I want them to print out as a single string. And you'll also notice what I just did. To answer the question, I just put it into Python and let Python answer the question for me. And if you're questioning something, if you're not sure how it works, it's okay to do this. Okay? It's okay to say what would happen if and give it a shot. I'm not saying you shouldn't ask the question. I think asking the questions are very important, especially in this forum. But if you're not in this forum and you're out there in PyCharm trying things, it's important to be able and to feel comfortable enough to just say, well, let me see what happens. Because I do that a lot when I program. I will sit down and start doing what-ifs in my brain, and I'll go out and try it while I'm programming. And I'll see what happens, and I'll throw that in my personal memory banks. So now, how do I combine some of this stuff together? Because what we're talking about here is converting user input to integers. Why is that important? Everything that comes in to Python from an input, everything that comes in from an input statement is a string, period, end of sentence. Python treats anything that comes from the input statement as a string. So if I wanted to add a value that I get in through an input statement, I have to turn it into something I can use because I can't add an integer to a string and I want to do a mathematical operation. So what do? I convert the string to an integer. And that's what they're doing here in figure 1.37. So I will just show you here. I have wage already, and we're just going to print wage so we're reminded of what it is. And then I want to take in my raise. So I'm going to say raise equals int input, enter my big raise. Okay? Now, another thing to notice here is I have an opening parenthesis for the int function. Int is a function. It's meant to convert strings to integers. I have an opening parenthesis. I have a matching closing parenthesis. I have included inside of that a call to the input function. The input function has an opening parenthesis, a string, and a closing parenthesis. Now, I have to make sure that my parentheses are balanced. So if I have two opening parentheses, I need to have two closing parentheses. And that's just an aside, but it is one of those things that trips new students up quite often. They'll get a weird error, and I'll show you that error in a minute, that will make not a lot of sense. But for now, I'm going to input my raise. Okay? So what did it tell me? Invalid syntax. What did I do? Raise equals int input, enter my big raise. That should have worked. Well, let's just try this part of it and see what happens. Because I'm actually inside the interpreter, so maybe I'm not doing something right. My big raise is going to be 4. Okay? So that should have worked then with raise. So I'm doing something wrong in the interpreter. I don't know what. Wage equals input. I don't know what this interpreter is telling me, and PyCharm would tell me if I had it. So I don't think it was the name, but let's check. Val equals int. Okay, it was something to do with the word raise, and I'm not quite sure why, but I'm not going to worry about it right now. So my raise is 4. So if I print val, I get 4. And now I can do something with wage and value. And I can say total equals wage plus val. And I can print total. Now you'll notice I didn't have to change total to a string at that point. And that's because I don't have another string in there. It's just the variable. I can print it. So now I have input, process, output. I have just completed the chain, the input, process, output chain. So this is the chain that you're going to be doing with everything you do in this class. You're going to be taking something in using the input function. You're going to be doing something with it, and in this case, it's just simple addition. And then you're going to be you're going to output the results. And in this case, the results are total. So let's go back down and work a little bit on, actually, we're getting kind of close. So I'm going to go down and work on one of the labs. That's a challenge activity, errors. I think I've shown you some errors. I don't know that we necessarily need to go through errors at this point. I think that you realize that errors may not be meaningful if you don't understand how an interpreter works. My suggestion is, for my students in my class, if you're getting an error, don't get frustrated, send me an email. I can usually answer the error, or tell you what's going on with that error pretty quickly and give you suggestions to move forward. For those who are not in my class, I can't talk to what your instructor will or won't do, but try not to get frustrated. And remember that oftentimes an error is not the line that you're looking at. It may be a line or two previous. So always look backwards. If your line of code looks fine, and when my PyCharm is up and working next week, I will be able to demonstrate how to use PyCharm for that. But when you're, sorry, my brain starts to frizzle out at 10 o'clock. Never fails. When you are looking at an error code or an error, always look backwards, because you will probably find that error in a line or two above where the error is, where Python's kind of pointing to. So that's syntax errors. Then there's logical errors where we've told the computer to do what we want it to do, or we think we have, and then the computer has done what we've told it to do, and it's not what we want it to do. That's a logical error, and every programmer makes them quite often. Even really, really, really experienced programmers make those quite often. So it's something to think about. Even though all your syntax is right, the logic may not be right, and you may have to go back and check the logic of the code. And those are a little bit harder to deal with, but as you move along in this course and move along in programming, you'll have less and less problems with that. So, style guides. I'm going to leave you guys to write the style guides and to understand what's going on with, like, conventions for naming variables and stuff. White space. Python is a language that is case and space dependent. So when you write Python code, this is a line of code. And I can't put two things on the same line. I can't say my val equals 4 and your val equals 5. If I do that, I get a syntax error, and it says there's an invalid syntax, and I detect it right there. Well, that's not really the problem. The problem is I have two lines of code on a single line. Python won't let me do this. So I have to say my val equals 4, well, and your val equals 5. So that is what we're talking about when it is case and space dependent. And as we go through, when we get into branching, you'll find out that it's even more dependent than that. But that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so now there's a participation activities. This is just an example salary calculation, so this is more process and output. Output art, this is just practice. and Mad Lib, okay? A lot of students have problems with this because they've not actually done a lot of word problems. So what are they asking us here? Let's start by reading through this particular lab. And it said, Mad Libs are activities that have a person provide various words which are then used to complete the short story in unexpected and hopefully funny ways. Okay, that's a nice description. Doesn't really tell me a lot about what I need to do. This next line starts to tell me what I need to do, and there are certain things that should pique my interest. It says, complete the program to read the needed values from input. When I see that word, it means I'm going to use the input statement. Okay? I'm going to use an input function, and I'm going to get in information from somebody typing it in on a command line and do something with it. If the existing outputs from input, that the existing output statements, that's a key word, can use to output a short story. So when it says output here, it means use the print function. So I know I'm going to be using the input function and the print function. And they give you an example of inputting 4 pieces of information, and then it shows you the expected output. So how do I use this? Okay. Well, from a strictly programming perspective, I have 4 variables. And I know that because I have first name, and then I have the string went to, and I have generic location, and to by, and whole number, and plural noun. These are not in quotes, okay? These are, in fact, variables. Now, if I ran this, it would not work. Let me just copy and paste that because it'll be faster. If I run this, just like that, I said, oh, wait a minute, my bad. Let's start with the word print and get that right. So I have this thing that says error, name first name is not defined. This particular error message is telling you that you have not defined a variable. How do I know I've not defined a variable when I look at this? Because no place in this script have I actually used first underscore name on the left-hand side of a single equal sign. And if I did that, I would then have the same problem with generic location, whole number, and plural noun. So what do I need to do? Well, I need to accept input 4 times because I have 4 variables. And I need to set the input to that variable. So let me show you just a couple examples. So I'm going to say first name equals input. Now, if I were normally doing this, I would have a string in here. zyBooks does not want you to put a string in there, so don't. And I'm going to say the first name is Lisa, and then I know. So let's do this. Don't do this inside part in zyBooks. I don't know what it's doing. It's not happy with my name of a variable. You shouldn't have to do that, and I don't think this is going to solve the problem. But okay, for some reason it wanted it in quotes. That is not what you're going to have to do in zyBooks. but that's just because I'm inside the interpreter. Now, if I copy this print statement again, you will see now that the issue is with generic location. And that's because it found first name because I created it. So now I can do the same with generic location. I can say generic location. And my location is going to be my happy place. And now I'm going to do the print statement again. And you won't have to do this print statement multiple times. You're only going to have to leave that print statement right where it is in the front. So now I'm at whole number, so I would do the same thing for whole number and the same thing for plural noun. So I would have 4 variables defined, and this print statement would work. So let's see. It's 10 o'clock. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, there's a question. Would you be able to go over the last 3 labs? I can go over them and at least talk through them. So let's see. What labs? Let's go look. So the last 3 labs are 21, 22, and 23. Okay, so divide by X. So let's see what it's saying. Write a program using integers, usernum and X as input, and output usernum divided by X 3 times. So let's do this, but we won't do all 3. We're going to do 2, and then you'll be responsible for the 3rd one. So I've got 2 user inputs, and again, I apologize because this would be clearer if I were using PyCharm. So I will make sure my PyCharm is fixed for next week. So I'm going to have, it says, usernum and X as input. So this means I'm going to use the input function. Because I have 2 variables, one called usernum and one called X, I'm going to have the input function used twice. And then I'm going to output usernum divided by X 3 times. So let's just start it with the first time. And I'm going to say usernum. Clear works now. Here. I think I'll just start this from scratch. Python. Actually, I'm just going to write it as a script and then run it. Lab 21.py. And it says I've got 2 things, so I'm going to, don't worry about what I just did. Okay? This is just something that brings in functionality that I need, but you won't have to do this in zyBooks. I am going to define user input, and I'm going to have it input. Now, if we go back and look at this problem statement, we're going to divide by something. Well, I've got a little problem in my script right now, because this is going to come out as a string. So what I need to do is I need to use the int function and surround this so that I can actually use it for division. And then I'm going to have X, and it's going to be the same thing. I'm going to need to use the int function. I'm going to input something. And then I have to divide by, I have to divide user input by X and print out the output each time. So I'm going to divide the IDE by X the first time. Now, by the way, this is a comment. I know it's a comment because it starts with a pound. This line will be ignored by the Python interpreter. And by the way, it's a good way for you to put information into a file that tells your professor that you know what you're doing. And in all the rubrics for all the programming, one of the things is whether or not you put comments in. So this is a comment. You want to put comments in. So now I'm going to divide, and I'm going to say user input equals user input, what is it? Divide by X. Then I'm going to print user input. So now I'm going to save this file, and I'm going to do Python -f lab. Whoops. I don't need the -f. Using the wrong tool. Okay. So it's going to wait, and it's going to look for a number. So I'm going to use the number 9 and the number 3, and it printed out 3. That's good. So I did it once. So now let me do lab 2-1, and I'm going to copy these again. Actually, let me do this. Sorry about the dinging. I'm going to copy this, and this is the second time. I'm going to run it. I'm going to put 9. I'm going to put 3, and it's going to go 3, 3, and 1. So 9 was my input, and 3 was my input, and my output is 3 and 1, because for the first division, I did 9 divided by 3, which is 3, and the second one is 3 divided by 3, which is 1. So I'm going to leave you with the final third one to do. And what you might also need to look at is the example to see, it says the output is 1,500 and 250. And in Python, integer division discards fractions. So 6 divided by 4 is 1. The 0.05 is discarded. And that's okay. So that's the beginning of lab 2.1. And you guys can finish the rest. So now we have one that's a little more complex. So we have this equation, which is going to be the process. Yep, hold on. How did the answers come out vertically rather than horizontally? Let's double check that. Let me see. I believe that you use the end. Let's do this. Let's do this. Whoops, that was wrong. Oh, what's that syntax? I don't often use that syntax. So I need to go back and look at Google. Python print end. By the way, I'm okay with you using Google. Your teachers, I can only speak for myself, but I don't have a problem if you go out and you use Google to answer a question. It makes perfect sense to me, and by the way, this is what I do. I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of Python or any other languages that I program, because I program in Java, and I use JavaScript, and I've programmed in C and C++ extensively, and I will probably be asked to learn other programming languages. I do not have an encyclopedic brain. If I don't know something, I go out and ask Google. So let's just see what they say. This is the first thing that came up. So, okay, ends the output with a space, which would probably answer your question, in 2.7, and So that should have worked. End equal quote, space quote, and that was in 2.7. That's the problem right here. I'm using Python 2.7, so the interpreter that I'm using currently is too old. However, so that's why I got that error. Hold on. This will work for you in zyBooks because they did a lot of changes between the 2.7 version of Python and the 3.0s of Python. So this is the way to do it, even though on my interpreter you don't get, this won't work, but in zyBooks that will work. So that should answer that question. Okay. So now let's go back and take a few minutes to look at the next one. Whoops. All right. So this is lab 2.2. What's it saying? This is a little bit more difficult. So they said the following equations estimate the calories burned when exercising. So these are some equations, and it says write a program using inputs age, years, weight, pounds, and heart rate, beats per minute, and the time, respectively. Output calories burned for women and men. It says for each floating point value with 2 digits after the decimal point, which can be achieved by the following. Okay? So this is a special format specifier for Python. And again, this isn't going to work in the 2.7 interpreter that I'm using. Next week, hopefully my PyCharm will be happy, and I will be able to run this. And if not, I'll have an IDE where I can. So basically what I have to do is I have to input 4 different variables, and then I have to perform these calculations, women's calories and men's calories, and output the results so they're like this. So we'll just go through women's calories, and then you guys can do the men's calories. So I'm going to VI-lab 2.py. I'm just going to paste that because it makes it easier for me. And ignore that import sys. That's just something I need because of the way I'm doing this. So I have 4 input statements. So if we go back and we look at the problem statement, and I may just copy the problem statement in here, write a program using inputs. So I know that I've got to use 4 inputs because that's what the program is telling me. I'm just going to put this here as a comment. Triple quotes, opening and closing, is also a comment. So I have 4 input statements, and those input statements are all going to be integers because I have years, pounds, beats per minute, and time. We can just assume they're all integers for now. So I'm going to have a variable named age, and I'm going to say input, int, input, and then I'm going to have weight, int, input, and then I'm going to say heart rate. You get the picture here. And then I'm going to have time. Anybody see the error that I created on the line above heart rate because I was typing too fast? There we go. So now, what do I want to do? I want to do a calculation and I'm going to say wcal equal. So here I have this complex calculation. Just going to copy and paste it. And wcal is going to equal my age, my weight, my heart rate. So all I have to do is replace these with the variables that represent what's in there, whoops, and the right operators. So you can't do an X for times, you have to do a star for times. And then this is going to be weight, same thing. And this is going to be heart rate. And this is going to be time. And this is a divide. And then for right now, I'm just going to print wcals. So let's see what happens when this runs and see if I did anything wrong syntactically. So I'm going to do a Python for lab22.py. And I have a syntax error because I forgot to change that X to a times. So I'm going to edit this. I'm going to go back here. I'm going to make this a times. So when I do this, I know I'm going to input age. I'm going to say 31. I wish I were still that young. I knew what I knew now. Weight, 120. Heart rate, 67. And time, we'll make it an hour. So you'll see what happened when I just print wcals. It came out with something like that. So, but that's not what you're going to have to do. When you work on this, you're going to need to use a print statement like this. And in this case, I used wcals as my variable. And I would put here instead of men, women. And then you're going to have to do this again for the men's calories and print and use this print statement for the men's calories. So what you want is you want your print statement to look identical to that except for this value. So you're going to have a print statement that has women, colon, space, the number of calories that you calculated, space, calories. And then you're going to have to do it again for men. So this gets you started for lab 1.22, and then we'll get you started for lab 1.23. So warm-up variables, input and type conversion. So that's what we're supposed to be doing here. And it says prompt the user to input an integer between 32 and 126, a float, a character, and a string storing each into separate variables, then output those four values on a single line separated by a space. Okay? So you've got these little fix me here. And they get you started by saying user int equals int input, enter an integer between that and that. So let's just copy these and give this a try. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to PI lab under lab 23.py. Don't worry about the import sys again. I'm just going to copy what I have there. So they've given us a start for user input. We have to input three things. So I need to input, and I'm going to need three variables because I have three types. I'm going to input, this is what's going to be input. Okay. We'll just copy this. So we're going to start with number 1, and then you're going to have to do number 2. So it also says extend to also output the reverse. So if you outputted, I'll show you what I mean, and then I'll show you what they mean by reverse. And then you have to extend it again to convert the integer to a character by using the char function and output the character. So I'm going to leave you to do 2 and 3, and I will show you how to do 1. Okay, so let me go here. Okay, so I've got user input for the float, which they've given us, sorry, for the integer, which they've given us. I need to have input for a float. Oops, sorry, float. And then I'm going to have user underscore char. And user stir. Now you'll notice I don't need to do a type conversion with a string, because input is always a string. So now all they want us to do is print them out with spaces. So I'm going to print. Is that right? I just want to double check what they want. So for 1, they're going to input it integer space float space character space string. That's all we want to do. So I'm going to print user int. Actually, I have to now convert this to a string. Everything's going to have to be string. Stir user int. I'm going to then say stir user float. I'm going to then say stir user char. And I'm putting spaces in between these to meet the requirements. And I'm going to print user stir. So let's try this. We'll run this and see what happens. So I'm going to do a Python lab23.py. And so I'm going to enter, I don't know, 42. Then I don't prompt here because zyBooks doesn't want you to prompt. But now I'm going to do a float, and the float is going to be 1.234. And then I'm going to enter, whoops. Why did it get me the input? Okay, float input. Yeah. Sorry about the bell, by the way. Okay, so let me see what happens now. And I think what's going on is because I should be using Python 3 and I'm not. Whoops. Let's go back and run this. So 42, enter a float, and that was the problem. 2, 3, 4. Enter a character. Char is not defined. Okay. My bad. a character and a string. So a character is just a single character. We're not here to make it work with my version of Python. Okay. So I'm going to run the Python again, and I'm going to enter 42, and I'm going to do 1.234, and I'm going to enter Z. Okay. I'm drawing a blank. I apologize. Okay, let's see what Google tells me. One character input. How do I do this? Well, that's user input. This is manipulating a string. That's an integer. Why doesn't it give me a single character? I should have been able to do that. Okay, that didn't tell me what I wanted to. Input, taking input. That's integer, string. Let's do this. Let me try running this one more time. (42) 1.234. Enter a character. Z. There we go. I just needed quotes. And this is because I'm using Python 2.7 and not 3. And a string is going to be my string. And it prints out what I needed to. It prints out 42, 1, 2, 3, 4, Z, and my string. And so now what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to satisfy the other two examples. So, whoops, I don't want to do that. I want to do this. So this did the first one. Whoops, gosh, I'm in VI. That satisfied 1. Now you're going to have to satisfy 2 and 3. So you're going to satisfy 2. It says output the 4 values in reverse. I'll tell you that you just have to modify a print statement. I would copy this print statement and then meet the criteria. And now it says you're going to convert the integer to a character and output that character. So you're going to have to do a conversion, and in this case to string, I think, but that's something you have to figure out. And then you're just going to output the character from the integer. So this is the beginnings for 1.23. You guys get to do number 2 and number 3. And I will post these labs, beginnings of these labs, on the, on my Google Drive, and the links will be in the announcement. So for those that stayed until 10:30 tonight, I hope that this was helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions, and if not, I'm going to end the conference call and fix my computer this weekend so my PyCharm works. Does anybody, go ahead, does anybody have any questions? Okie dokie. Everybody have a good evening and a nice weekend. Oh, no problem. I'm glad you were able to find it helpful. I'm